Welcome to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast is my friend Rebekah Clark. Welcome to the podcast, Rebekah.
Thanks, Richard. So happy to be here.
Rebekah is zooming in from Wisconsin, Green Bay, where she's lived for about 7 years. She's in her 30s. She's been married nearly 10 years, has 3 kids, active member of the church, has a degree from BYU, looking at grad school. We're going to talk about OCD. Rebekah has had OCD as long as she can remember, maybe 20 years. And so this will be a podcast with Rebekah bravely sharing her story. One of the things I like about this podcast is that she's been on this road for a long time, and I think it can help some of you that are just kind of figuring this out about yourself, or parents or other loved ones that are trying to see this and help others. And Rebekah has lots of different types of OCD, so this won't just be kind of one story, and even how OCD kind of moves around at times. So we said a prayer. We're just going to kind of get started. Thanks again for your courage to do this. Anytime someone opens up and has the guts to share their story, they become my instant hero, Rebekah. So on behalf of all of our listeners, thanks for doing this. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, as you said, I live in Wisconsin. I'm a mom of 3 kids, ages 9, 6, and 3. And so they definitely keep me on my feet. My husband and I are founders of a nonprofit called Village Book Builders, when we bring libraries to developing countries. And so it's been a huge blessing that I've been able to travel to places like Malawi, Africa, and different parts of Mexico to help with those. I also am passionate about LGBTQ advocacy. My LGBTQ friends are some of the people that I admire most, and I've been grateful to be involved as an admin for Mormons Building Bridges and a leader in my local affirmation chapter, which is the Affirmation Chicago chapter, as well as doing allies and appetizers, which I love. Oh, and one other thing, I love ice cream. So I could give me a carton of ice cream and I could probably polish off the whole thing if I didn't make myself stop.
That is great. I'd kind of forgotten your work in the LGBTQ space. That's a wonderful chapter, the Chicago chapter. We've had a couple people on already from that chapter, and we've got Valerie Green coming on next week or two. That's part of that group, I think. There, you're nodding your head.
Yep. I know her and love her.
So she's wonderful. Just tell us why you decided to come on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have had OCD my whole life of 32 years. And for pretty much that whole life, I've been very private about it, rarely opening up to a few friends here and there, but for the most part, keeping it inside. But I've been feeling the desire lately to want to open up. I think I have a desire to be able to connect more authentically with people. And I feel like the way to do that is to share my journey and, be able to have people hear my story and me hear their story so that we can connect. Also, I have a desire to be able to help people with my story. I mean, I've been walking this road a long time, and I hope that there are people out there who, like you said, they're new to the journey or have children that are struggling, since I struggled even as a child, or, people that just want to understand. I hope to be able to lend some insight to that. And actually, I was inspired because I listened to your recent episode with the Real OCD Club at BYU. And as a former BYU student, I was super excited to hear about this club they're doing there. I wish I had something like that when I was there. And I think it's so wonderful they're doing that. And it was fun, too, because one of the club founders, Caitlin, is a friend of mine. She actually went on one of our Village Book Builder trips. So I met her in Mexico as we were working on a library together. And at the time, I had no idea that she had OCD, and she had no idea that I had OCD. But at least I can speak for myself, I just adored her, thought she was awesome. And so it was fun to see what she's been up to with the Real OCD Club. And I was inspired that, I really want to speak up more and see if there's ways that I can help people with my story.
That's cool. That was a really good episode. That's episode 343, listeners. And we on listenlearnandlove.org, if you go to that website, across the toolbar at the top, one of the toolbar notes is podcasts. And if you pull down podcasts, we have a whole section now. There's so many podcasts, we divided them into sections, and there's a section on depression, mental illness, OCD. So all these podcasts, if you want to learn more about OCD and hear more stories in addition to Rebekah's will be there. That's a great place to hear other stories and not have to try to figure out which of the 350 podcasts are OCD related. But thanks for just, talk about, it's really brave what you're doing. When did it kind of first show up for you? Talk about, it sounds like since the beginning of time.
Yeah, pretty much. For me, OCD showed up when I was about 6 years old, when I was in first grade. And my teacher called my mom and called my parents and told them that she was concerned because in general, I was teach type of student, really obedient, really hardworking, that sort of thing. But she was having this problem where I kept getting up to wash my hands. We had a classroom sink in our first grade classroom, and she'd be teaching and I kept getting up to wash my hands. And she had asked me to stop, but I just seemed like I couldn't stop. And also she was concerned because when I did my worksheets, I would write something and then thinking that it wasn't perfect, I would erase it and then I'd write it again. Still didn't feel perfect. So I'd erase it again. I do that over and over to the point that my papers would start to get holes in them. And I don't think she knew what was going on, and my parents didn't know what was going on either. We didn't have a name for it, and we wouldn't have a name for it for years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could go back and talk to your 6-year-old self and have some wonderful conversations. That's 26 years ago, roughly. Keep sharing your journey. 6 years old.
Several years later, when I was 11 or 12, is when, I had OCD that whole time, and there were little ways that it would show up. But throughout my journey, there's been times when it's really spiked, when it's really been extra severe. And the first time in my life when it was extremely severe was when I was 11 or 12. And at that time, the main kind of OCD that I struggled with was scrupulosity, which I know you've talked on the podcast about before. And I would struggle with things like I was so filled with anxiety. And that's okay. So that's the thing with OCD. For those who don't know how it works, you have the obsession, which is like something a thought that keeps coming to your head that you are so anxious and scared about. So in this case, I was so anxious about being righteous. And of course, being righteous is a good thing, but OCD takes it to a whole nother level where it's just off the charts, where you're like, I've got to be anxious, I've got to be righteous. And it just fills you with so much anxiety that you feel the urge to do a compulsion, which is the other part of OCD, which is an action that you do to try to relieve the anxiety. But of course, you do the compulsion, and for a little while it relieves it, but then the thought just comes back, the anxiety comes back. So you keep doing the compulsion to try to relieve it. And so when I was 11 and 12, I was scared to death of lying. And so if my parents, say I saw my dad go down the stairs, and then my brother would come into the room and say, "Hey, Rebekah, have you seen Dad?" And I would say, "I think he's gone downstairs, maybe." So I added "I think" and "maybe" to everything I said during that time, just with the overarching fear that maybe I'd accidentally lie. Same thing with obedience. My mom would come in to tuck me in at night. I would confess to her all the quote unquote terrible things that I, as an innocent kid, had done, like brushing my hair when it was wet out of the shower instead of using a comb. I guess she told me not to do that. And so when I did, I felt so horribly guilty that I had to confess. And then probably the story that kind of illustrates where I was at that point the best. That's kind of a hard story for me to share because you'll see why. I was scared to death of not paying enough tithing. And I remember one day when I was probably 11, I was counting out the amount of tithing that I needed. And I'd figured out that I needed 8 pennies to pay on the 80 cents. And I had those 8 pennies in my hand, but there was a part of my brain that questioned. OCD is the doubting disease. So it doubted. I knew it was 8 pennies. Part of me did, but part of me questioned, am I wrong? Am I counting it wrong? And if I am, then I'll be sinning because I won't be paying a full tithing. And so my mom tells me that I looked at her with just utter humiliation because, of course, I know how to count. But so with utter humiliation, but also just utter fear, and looked at her and said, Mom, is this 8 pennies?
Wow.
And so I needed that reassurance that I had counted it right, because my OCD part of my brain just couldn't accept that maybe I had made a mistake with it.
I love you just sharing real examples, because I think that helps us all sort of go reflect about our own selves and others in our lives. And it helps us better pick up that. I love that you said you want to do the compulsion. Do you have examples of the compulsions you do in this stage of wanting to be so righteous? And is that, I think you did say one, you'd confess to your mother every night before you went to bed. Just other examples that come to mind, Rebekah, of the compulsions to sort of relieve the scrupulosity, and maybe even talk to our listeners about why the compulsions don't really solve scrupulosity.
Sure. So in the case of the being concerned about lying, the compulsion was to add maybe or I think onto everything. And you're right about the compulsion with the obedience obsession. The compulsion was to confess to my mom. Another example is I became concerned about gluttony. So I was scared of overeating, not because of gaining weight, but because I had heard that gluttony might be a sin. And so there were times when I wouldn't eat very much for fear that I would take it too far and overeat. So that was the compulsion for me.
Those are great examples. Just keep sharing your story more. Just as I think chronologically.
And I'm sorry, I just realized you asked for thoughts on how the compulsion doesn't help in the long run.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the crazy thing about OCD is the compulsion helps you feel better for a little bit. It relieves that anxiety, but it's very short-lived. And in the long run, it actually makes it worse. And I learned this later when I was in therapy at a much older age. I didn't know this at the time, and my parents didn't know it at the time. But actually, for instance, when I was confessing to my mom, and of course, she's saying, "Oh, sweetie, you don't have to worry about that. Like, it's not a big deal." That was reassuring me. And for a moment, it made me feel better. But in the long run, it actually made me worry about it more, because it kind of like reaffirms that your fears are real, that you had a reason to be concerned to begin with. Same with like the tithing, like when she's confirming that, yes, of course I have eight pennies. It's reaffirming that I needed that reassurance that I could have been wrong. Whereas I would find out later when I was much older that the best thing with OCD, with the help of a therapist who's trained in this, is to learn to live with the uncertainty. So going back, if we had known this at the time, and if we had had the help of a trained therapist, they would have told my mom not to tell me that was 8 pennies, to say, that's something you need to figure out. You might be wrong, you might be right. And I would have to learn to live with, I could be making a mistake. But in the short term, that causes tremendous anxiety. But in the long term, it lessens the amount of obsessions and compulsions you have, because you learn that life is uncertain, and that's okay.
That's great. It's really powerful. I would never have believed what you just said was the right thing to do until I've listened to all these stories about scrupulosity. It is fascinating for me, because intuitively as a parent, I would do the same thing your parent did. And as a bishop, in a situation where someone's confessing things they don't need to confess, I would over reassure them they don't need to confess. So whenever I hear these stories, I just go, oh my goodness, and light bulbs go off in my brain about how unusual scrupulosity is, and especially for people that are active and committed to their faith and very deeply committed, attacks the things that are most important to you. Do you want to just keep sharing? I don't know if you want to talk more about scrupulosity, or if you just want to talk about as you're aging up, other OCDs or how things changed as you got older.
Yeah, I love what you said about being aware as leaders. I think, there were many times as a teenager that I would go to temple recommend interviews with my bishop, and I was so nervous about it. I had anxiety about that because I wanted to make sure I was telling the truth, wanted to make sure doing it. And I was like the perfect kid. Like I didn't do, anything abnormally wrong at all. And so I think it's really good for bishops and other leaders to be aware. Like if you're seeing someone who's coming to you and confessing the same thing over and over, for instance, then that's probably OCD, and just be aware it's probably not a spiritual problem that's going on necessarily. It could be that it's just their brain, having issues with the scrupulosity. And also, one thing I'm super grateful for with my mom in that time, that I think is a good example for parents, is she knew something was wrong, and my parents knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was. And at the time, internet wasn't even a big thing yet. And so she wasn't able to just, search and get answers. So she did a lot of research at the library, got lots of books, and was able to discover obsessive compulsive disorder. And for me, I remember her bringing these books home, and she was reading them to try to help me, and I wanted to read them. And at first she was super hesitant because she's like, wait, if you read these, is it going to give you ideas of more obsessions and compulsions to add on? And I understand that fear. But thankfully, she did let me read them. And I remember the utter relief that washed over me as a 12-year-old kid going, oh my gosh, I'm not crazy. There's a name for this. I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. And it was so comforting to me. So I'm so grateful for the compassion that she had, and the work that she did to search out answers to help me.
That's cool. That's really cool. Um, yeah, just kind of keep sharing how did things change as you got older, and I don't know if you want to talk about other types of OCD or how things how things got better. Just kind of this time between 12 years old and this 20 years between that age and where you are now.
Right. So it's so funny. Like OCD can really shift. You talked about how it plays on what's most important to you. And in my life, it's played on things that are really important to me in that period of my life. And so as I got older, I found that, I always had the OCD, but it wasn't quite as severe as it was at that point. Into my teen years, I was a pretty normal teen kid, involved in lots of activities, good student and stuff. But there was always in the background, OCD was always there. Things were always going on. One of the main struggles I had was, school was very important to me and doing well in school. And so I had a fear about like losing a paper for my schoolwork or something else that I needed for school. So I remember in middle school and high school, I would check. It's another kind of OCD, is checking and counting. So I would check and count to make sure all the zippers on my backpack didn't come undone so I wouldn't lose anything. Because I had a backpack that had like 5 zippers on it. So throughout the school day, whenever the thought entered my head, oh man, something might have fallen out of your backpack, and then you wouldn't have your homework assignment or whatever. So throughout the day, I would count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, they're all closed. And then a few minutes later, the thought would hit me again. What if something caused one to open? And so I would constantly be checking. But this was going on in the background as I lived a pretty normal life, and nobody knew except for my parents that something was going on. And with OCD, a lot of us get super good at hiding it because there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of misunderstanding. And so I didn't want people to know. So I would, do my checking when nobody was looking and just live life.
What would
it wasn't, and also through college, like I had some relationship OCD show up in a relationship I was in. I had checking, just, a lot of it was checking throughout that time. It wasn't until I was married and had my first baby that I had another bout of where OCD went from being in the background to really coming to the forefront and being extra severe.
Tell us about that.
So I got married to my wonderful husband, Tyler, when I was 22, and we had our first baby pretty quick. We were pregnant within about 4 months, I think, of being married. And so our first child, Emma, was born just a month and a year after we got married. And of course, we love her and adore her. From the beginning, though, she hated sleep. And it makes me laugh now because she's 9.5 and she still hates sleep more so than even her younger siblings. She's always been the most difficult to get to sleep and still is. But as a baby, she did not sleep. She, of course, had the normal newborn stage of not sleeping, but that continued on and on. It wasn't until she was about 11 months old that she had her first time of sleeping through the night.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it was rough. And even then, it wasn't like every night that she would sleep through. So, and
you
it
have
was
two
about
more kids.
Yeah, sorry.
And you have 2 more kids.
Yeah. There's we changed some stuff with that. You'll learn. But I found that, and of course, I'd never experienced what this is like before. But I found that with my OCD, I needed to be able to have complete mental and emotional strength, I guess, to live life. And when I was not getting sleep, I didn't have that mental and emotional strength that I needed. And so when I was being woken up constantly, it caused my OCD to just go off the rails. I also had postpartum depression come into the mix at that point. And so I had depression and OCD both just going crazy. And it got to the point where like I would she would wake up and then I would try to go back to sleep, but I was so anxious that she was going to wake up again. And I didn't know when she would wake up again that I would lie there having trouble going back to sleep even when she was. Um, and so I was getting no sleep. I also, as she got a little bit older, I found out that, that they recommend often as babies get older, putting them on a schedule, and that sometimes that can, if they're getting good sleep during the day, it can affect how they sleep at night. And so I was desperate to get sleep myself. And so I put her on a schedule to try to get her to sleep better. And I did find that it helped a little bit. So in my desperation to get more sleep at night, I became OCD-ish. I make OCD an adjective sometimes. I think that I don't know if anybody else does that, but I became OCD-ish about her sleep schedule. So like where I was planning to the minute when I wanted her to go to sleep. Now, of course, I couldn't really control when she'd fall asleep, but I would plan to the minute when I was going to start her wind down to try to get her ready to go to bed. And if there were things that got in the way of that, I would just be flooded with anxiety and just, I just had to have it scheduled and had to have it perfect in hopes that maybe I'd be able to get some sleep that night. And to be honest, that was a point in my life where OCD really took control, where most of my life people couldn't tell. But at that time in my life, if you had interacted with me on something that touched on my baby's sleep, like if you tried to schedule something with me where I was trying to schedule around my baby's naps, you would have been able to tell that something was kind of odd, that I was ultra focused to an abnormal level on my baby's sleep schedule. I also had checking go crazy because, of course, what's more important to a new mom than their baby's safety? And so I had a lot of checking rituals that developed around making sure my baby stayed safe. Things like making sure that her swaddle was on just right so that it wouldn't suffocate her, even though it wouldn't. Like I just, because I was doing a good job with it, so it wouldn't. But I would check it and then, have doubts, had the obsession that maybe I did it wrong and she was going to suffocate. So I'd recheck it. Same with and again, no matter how many times I checked it, I still wasn't sure that it was safe. And I would do the same with the doors. I would lock the doors at night, but then I'd have the doubt that it was really locked. I'd recheck it. I'd be staring at it, trying to convince myself, because part of my brain knew. That's a crazy thing with OCD is like part of your brain knows that it's good. You know that you did it. But the other part of your brain still has that doubt. Like maybe I messed it up. And so no matter how many times I checked and rechecked, I still had the fear of what if I didn't? What if it's wrong? And what if someone breaks it and hurts my baby?
Wow.
That's painful. And that's powerful.
This is a really good part of the podcast, Rebekah. No one's ever really named checking OCD. Is that, did you name that, or is that a common name that people would be recognized that have had the same challenges?
It's a pretty common one. you can check different things, but it is pretty common to have checking doors, checking ovens that they're off, that sort of thing. Having fears that someone's going to break in or a fire's going to start. It's a pretty common thing.
I mean, I have some of that. I don't want to make this podcast about me, but I go pick up our company mail a lot, and it's just in a box 2 stories down and in our office building, and I open it and I put my hand in, I pull all the mail out, and then I lock it. And as I'm going up the stairs, I think there's something still in there. And I go back and there's nothing in there. And as you're talking about this, I realize I have a little bit of that. When I close my garage at night on my car, I hear it go down. I can't actually see it go down. I hear it go down, but I go, I better just make sure it went down. And
right.
It kind of ends there. I don't spend a lot of time but it's some of that. So I resonate with that. What's and I think you've done this already, but explain the downside of having checking OCD to the extent you do, and how you solve or manage that.
Yeah. So it's funny you should say that, because I think it's a continuum, right? Like, I think we all have times when we do something and then they're like, wait, did I do that? And if it's something important, we might want to check. And I think some of us might have more of that than others. But in order to be clinically diagnosed as OCD, it has to reach a certain level. Like, I think I might be wrong on these numbers, but I think it has to impact your life where you're spending at least like 1 to 3 hours a day maybe on it.
Uh-huh.
I might be wrong on those numbers, but it's a certain level where it's significantly impacting your life. And it's hard to explain even the amount of anxiety that you have in that moment when you're locking it and relocking the door. Like, it's like you almost feel like, if I mess this up, my baby's going to be killed. And
that's honest.
I think I probably messed it up. Like, it's this powerful anxiety that just floods over you head to toe, and you get locked in where you can't stop doing the compulsion because you're never sure.
In my example, the left your mail in the mailbox or the garage door up is very different than your child. So in this specter of this range, even the worst case scenario of leaving the mail in, I just get it the next day. But you're thinking of really grave situations with that OCD relating to your child's safety. That's brutal.
Yeah. And it's tough. And
it's really tough.
And at the time I wasn't in therapy yet. But my therapist now tells me that in order to work on something like that, you'd start small. So you wouldn't start with the compulsions and obsessions that cause you the most anxiety. You'd start with the ones that cause a little bit of anxiety. And before you move up to the harder ones. But what you do is called exposure and response prevention. It's part of CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's the recommended treatment for OCD. And so what they have you do is take obsession and compulsion that are, that cause you it would cause you anxiety not to do the compulsion, but it's not your highest level. And you have the obsession, you have the anxiety come to your mind, but you purposely don't do the compulsion. Or if you're trying to start really slow and build up, you might do it, but do it changed. Like, for instance, I had a certain order that I locked the doors in, and I get stuck doing each one over and over, but I had that order. And so my therapist might have me switch up the order. So I can still do it, but a different order. So anything you can do to kind of change up the OCD, because OCD wants everything to be exactly how it's scheduled. So anything you can do to switch it up. And then you build over time, because what happens is as you get used to at first you have tremendous anxiety from not doing the compulsion. And it's terrifying because you're thinking that thing that you're so afraid of is going to happen. But over time, your body, it's called habituation. Your body habituates to that feeling, and that feeling doesn't feel quite as strong anymore over time. And so over time, you're able to build up and do more and more of the ERP.
ERP, exposure
response prevention. Yeah.
Exposure response prevention. I was interested that you said that the OCD really spiked when you were sort of stretched emotionally with the baby, being up, less sleep, postpartum. And so I would guess, just that this maybe happens for others, that their OCD is there, but when they're not operating sort of on all cylinders, that then it's more likely to keep into their lives. And it's not a spiritual weakness. It's just I don't know the right vocabulary. You're more vulnerable if it's there, kind of below the surface. So I like you sharing that part. Other listeners may resonate with that. Yeah, just keep. How did things get better? Just this time between these 20 years of dealing with this and where you are now.
Yeah. So this went on for a really long time that things were really, really rough. And, you know, to be honest, I was just barely holding it together. And that's why people could tell that, that interacted with me on certain subjects could tell that something was wrong. I was in a deep, deep, deep depression. I was spending hours and hours every day on my rituals throughout the day. And I was just, I mean, it was miserable. I was just anxious
Wow.
and depressed. And OCD had really just taken over my life. I went from OCD being always there to just being front and center. And to
Wow.
be honest, in order for things to get better, which they have, but in order for that to happen, I had to hit rock bottom. And what that looked like for me is I had an experience. This was when my daughter was probably about a year and a half. So this has been going on for about a year and a half. And I had an experience where someone that I know said some stuff to me. They were concerned by what they saw with my obsessiveness about my baby's sleep schedule. And I had inconvenienced them by my obsessiveness about the sleep schedule. And they expressed that something had to change, that I was causing my husband and my baby to suffer because of what I was doing and experiencing. And because I was so low already, I took that to heart, where I believed that my husband and baby, I was causing them to suffer, and that my husband and baby would be better off without me in their lives. So at that point, I became suicidal. And it was the lowest point I ever hit, but I wanted to relieve my poor husband and baby from the struggle that I was bringing into their lives. So I believed they'd be better off if I wasn't there. And I never did act on that, but for a while I really wanted to. I really thought it would be best for them.
Thanks for having the courage to share that. There's maybe others that feel that way right now, that um, their family or others would be better off without them here, or somehow our presence is messing up other people's lives. So that's something that I've learned some people have concluded that's not true. Talk about, is that OCD, or was it kind of a combination of everything coming together in sort of this vortex or whatever, the perfect storm of multiple things going on that led you to feel like that was um and I realize some people actually believe that everybody would be better off without them. So talk more about that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent analogy. It was a vortex of the perfect storm. The depression combined with the anxiety, combined with, you know, what the messages I was getting from people around me and that specific experience. It, I look back now and I have compassion for who I was. This was 8 years ago. Um, and I understand how I got to that point. But I also can say so powerfully that belief that I had that my husband and daughter would be better off without me was such a complete lie. But that's what my brain was telling me. And I'm grateful, so grateful that I didn't act on that. But I would say to anybody who's in that position, like, what you're thinking now, like, it's so impossible to believe that couldn't be true. But like, things change. Things change.
What got you out of that space, Rebecca?
So it was a process. But at that point, I decided that I needed to see a therapist. And I sought one out. It took some looking around to find the right one, as it often does. But I was able to find one that was a good fit and that specialized in OCD. And she actually had OCD herself, which was kind of a
Cool.
cool thing for me. Yeah. So she, of course, was not in a deep dark place with it. Had done work to come to a good place with it, but still had OCD, because OCD doesn't go away, but it can lessen to an extent where it's even considered subclinical, with if you put the work in and over time. But like, it was. And I would add, besides just saying if you put the work in, I'm sure there's people who put so much work in and it doesn't feel like it's ever going to get to that point. I think there's other factors as well. But she was at a point in her life where she was really healthy, but she still had OCD, and she would keep up the exposure response prevention every day, just kind of practice with it so she could keep herself in a healthy place. Um, and she really helped me to give myself some compassion, to kind of realize that, I'm human and I'm dealing with something really, really hard, and it's okay. And she helped me to realize that I had gifts to bring to the world, and I, it really helped me a lot. She also referred me to a psychiatrist who could prescribe medication. And I had been on medication from the time I was 12 until that point. But it didn't really seem to be helping me much. And that's the strange thing I've learned, is like some medications help different people, and than others do. And um, the psychiatrist prescribed a new medication. And when I went on the medication, it was night and day with the depression. I
Okay.
guess it was just the right one for me when it came to depression, and it helped me immediately to be less depressed. I would say that, of course, at this point, my daughter was a year and a half, so I was getting some sleep at this point. Um, a lot more sleep than I had for the first year of her life. But that helped me a ton. So the combination of the medication and the therapy was very powerful. Also, I had been getting priesthood blessings from my husband throughout this time, and I was at a point where I had a hard time connecting with the spirit, because not because I was doing anything wrong, but just because the depression and anxiety were so powerful in my mind. It made it hard to feel that and to feel the love of my Heavenly Father. Um, but my husband gave me some priesthood blessings, and I still have them written down in my journal notes from those, because
Cool.
it was so meaningful. Yeah, it was so meaningful to me to get these messages from my Heavenly Father that I couldn't receive myself. And one of the priesthood blessings, he was inspired to share some things that I should do to kind of help me get out of this place. And this was after, I don't know why the Lord didn't give me this advice a long time beforehand, because this was after, going through this for a year and a half. But the things I was told to do were service, finding a way so I could get outside myself and serve. Which I did. I started volunteering at a pregnancy resource clinic to help women in unplanned pregnancies, and I loved it. I fell in love with those women and was able to help there. Also, exercise, which helps my body and my brain release those endorphins and get healthier. Also, what we called hour alone time, which is where I would go out for an hour once a week and just pray, ponder, read the scriptures. This was the first time in my life where I started asking questions and really seeking for the answers that I was hoping to find. And then getting the sleep that I needed, which we would go on, as you said beforehand, to have two more kids. And what we found in the future is we knew that I could not handle my OCD when I was not getting sleep. And so with kids 2 and 3, my husband got up with the babies. I would sleep in a different room. He would get up with them. It was hard for me at first, because I thought a good mom has to breastfeed, and I'm going to breastfeed. But I learned that I could breastfeed during the day, but in order for the health of myself,
Cool.
my husband, our whole family, we had to make a decision that was right for us. And for us, I could breastfeed during the day. He would bottle feed at night. I would get the sleep I needed. And oh my gosh, when I get 7.5 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, I can handle this. It makes all the difference in the world.
That's a great segment. There's a couple of things I just love in there. I love you being honest. You couldn't feel the spirit, and realizing that wasn't a spiritual weakness. And I think listeners need to hear that. I felt that at times in my life, and never had any tools to navigate that. That might just be my emotion, the chemicals needed in my body to feel emotion and feel the spirit and feel right were lacking. And I love that's the way where medication can replace those missing chemicals to help us feel right. And that allows us to be more likely to feel the spirit. So I recognize that on one level, you knew you weren't doing anything wrong to feel the spirit, but you still couldn't feel it. And I just think we have to have compassion for ourselves and for others that open up, they can't feel the spirit, and not create shame in our culture for people that say, I don't feel the spirit anymore. And my normal reaction would be to give them a checklist of things to feel the spirit. And this isn't a spiritual weakness. It's a symptom of an emotional challenge that is a spiritual symptom, so to speak, but it's not solved by spiritual tools. I love the role of your husband in giving those priesthood blessings. And he's probably scratching his head at times, wondering, how do I help my wife? I think a lot of us at times are deeply committed, but not always sure what to do. So I'd love you to give advice for spouses, because I'm sure there were some stressful days in your marriage and some great days. But and your good husband probably would have some thoughts to share too also. But what advice do you give for family or spouses trying to help someone with OCD?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean those early years. I mean, we're practically newlyweds, anyways. I
Right.
mean, our baby was born when we've been married for a year, and so we're going through this crazy time. He knew I had OCD when we got married. I'd shared that with him when we were dating, but neither of us knew to what extent that was going to affect things when we had our first baby. Neither of us had any idea. Um, and it's hard. I guess the things that come to mind are know that things can get better. Those dark days, they were some really dark days, but honestly, it strengthened our relationship. Looking back, I realized that we're
That's cool.
stronger and closer because we went through that together. He was so loving and supportive and patient. I mean, I'm sure there were times I was very frustrating, of no fault of my own, but OCD just does that. So just I would say, try to be patient, seek out your own self-care, take care of yourself while you're helping your loved one. And try to talk and ask questions and, try to understand the best that you can and support your spouse in getting the professional help that they need. Because when it comes to something like this, it's not enough, the exercise, the hour alone time, the service, like those were important pieces, but none of it would have worked if I hadn't gotten the therapy and the medication because, these psychological issues, they need that professional help. And so my husband supported me and said, I'll watch our daughter, you go to therapy. He supported me in those things. And that was really important.
This is a beautiful love story. I love, yeah, I mean, this is, I would think, there's deeper communication ability. My guest last night's podcast talked about emotional intelligence, and I would guess there's just better emotional intelligence about relationships and about communication, about mental health issues that's part of your marriage that now brings you together closer. And I think you have young kids right now, reasonably young kids, but I would guess that this journey, and it's, you're already very aware of this issue not being a negative thing, just what it is, as you're parenting your own kids and other people, and just be in a position to um, help your kids. And they may never have OCD, but they may have something else. And you'll just, I also like where your husband and your spouse, you recognize that sometimes when we kneel across the altar in our temple marriages, we talk rightly so about there's three people in our marriage. There's each other and there's the Savior, and we're kind of going in this covenant. But sometimes I just recognize we need other people in our lives that can help us. And a therapist is one of those for many wonderful couples. And I think you're teaching this, but I think we can't be each other's therapist. We can be each other's spouse. We can be each other's confident best friend, but there's people sometimes outside of our marriage that have expertise, medical. We go to a doctor for a broken arm. So I think normalizing therapy, we need Jesus and a therapist. We need Jesus and a doctor to fix our broken arms is part of what you're bravely doing here just by sharing your story and destigmatizing OCD and emotional illness, if I'm using the right vocabulary. I just want to mention, just because I've been writing about this in another book I'm doing about improving LDS culture, and I'm talking about suicide in this chapter. And the Joyner model of suicidality is one that a few of my guests have mentioned, Joiner listeners. And he has three things here that are predictors of suicide. And one is the thing that Rebekah talked about is perceived burdenedness. And it's the view that one's existence burdens family, friends, or society. This view produces the idea that my death will be worth more than my life. I'm sorry to read this. My death will be more than my life to family, friends, and society. And it's just a potentially fatal misperception. The second one is low belonging and social alienation, a low sense of belonging, and one being alienated from others, not integral into the family circle of friends or valued. And a third one is just an acquired ability to enact lethal self-injury. And I do that in the context of a little bit for LGBTQ Latter-day Saints, but the model applies to all of us. Were those other ones, just any thoughts on that as you're hearing that, Rebekah, and how that applied to your situation?
Yeah. I'm grateful that I had the people around me, especially my husband. I was able to have that connection and not feel completely alone. And I also had other people in my life that cared about me. And, even if they didn't know exactly what was going on or didn't, understand that they cared about me. I think something that this experience has been a gift for me in is that I get what it's like to be in that kind of a low place. And so for my friends who are LGBTQ, many of them have been in that place, or my friends who have had other things that have led them to that dark place, even though our experiences of how we got there are different, I can relate to that. I know what that's like. And that's been a powerful thing.
Yeah, I love that. And feeling pain, and it just gives you more empathy. You see, tell us more about your story. How are things now? More about how things got better. Advice you give to other people that are in the thick of this. You've done some of that already.
Yeah. So I've been so blessed. Things are so much better now. It's been cool for me to prepare for this interview because I've been looking back on what things were like back then compared to what they're like now. And it's like, oh my gosh, that feels miraculous.
Cool.
The changes that have taken place. And, I don't want to downplay OCD. It's still something I deal with every single day. My husband compares it to running a marathon with a 100-pound backpack. And so every day I run my marathon and I still have that 100-pound backpack, and man, is it heavy. But when I'm able to get the sleep I need, when I have therapy, which now, during the dark time, I had to do therapy every week. Now I do it once or twice a month. I talk to my therapist, and it just kind of helps keep me up and going. I still take medication every day. When I do those things to take care of myself, I can carry that backpack. It's hard, but I can do it, and I can do all the normal things. I'm a mom to my 3 children. Right now we're doing online school with COVID. I'm able to serve in ways that are meaningful to me. I'm able to do those things because I'm taking care of myself. I'm just carrying that backpack. And I've come to the point where, I still have OCD in my life. And one of the things where it manifests itself the most right now is something called just right OCD or perfectionism OCD. I'm very concerned because I have 3 little kids. My brain makes me have anxiety about something. And right now my brain's making me have anxiety about making sure that I accomplish everything that I need to take care of my kids and their schedules and school and all that stuff. I make sure I don't miss anything from my schedule. And so I tend to have a lot of mostly mental rituals, going through and checking and counting and making sure I dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. But one thing that's cool is I've gotten to the point with therapy that I don't really do rechecking. It used to be that I would check something and I would immediately have thought again I needed to recheck, and then I'd recheck and I'd get stuck in the spiral. But I'm at the point now where I can do the check, and then sometimes the thought comes back in to recheck, but I'm able to label that, no, that's OCD.
Cool.
I'm moving on with my life. And and it just freed things up so much. Something else that's hard for me as part of the Just Right OCD is like writing. I'm perfectionist about writing. I'm scared that I'm going to, not write it perfectly. And my therapist has been helping me try to learn to do that. But like, they're not things that take over my life anymore because I have the mental power and the training with a therapist to be able to, recognize that and stop that before it goes too far and to just live with it. And it's part of me. It's part of who I am. To be honest, my biggest challenge at this point in my life is shame. It's looking back on, I think a lot of it is not speaking up, not being authentic about what my experience is and has been, and feeling alone in that. I think I have a need to be real with people, to connect with people authentically. So that's part of the reason I wanted to do this, is I want to say, you know what, this is part of me. And I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to be ashamed anymore that I'm different and weird. Like, most people don't know I have OCD. Like they don't know that I don't come across as weird, I don't think, but like, I want people to know this part of me. And I also have been learning that I always saw OCD as completely a negative thing. And, it's called a disorder, and there's good reason for that. I mean, you can see in my story ways in which it was absolutely a negative thing and led me to a very dark place. But I'm also learning that there's another side to that. There's the disability side, but there's also what Frank King, I believe his name is. I saw this TED Talk they did where he talked about how mental illness is also combined with kind of a superpower. Like, I am really detail oriented. I'm really good with numbers and details and organization because I want everything to be perfect and just right. And if I can use that in a way that's positive instead of in the way that, sometimes the negative ways OCD wants me to use it, it can be used for good. OCD has brought me tremendous empathy. I care about everybody and their story and wanting to be there for them. I care about marginalized groups. I care about individuals. And I think that's given me a superpower as well. And I actually am right now looking at grad schools because I want to be able to use those superpowers to be able to help people. I originally was looking at a master's of social work. I'm now also looking at the possibility of a master's of public health, but using it in social areas. So like doing research, possibly epidemiology, which I thought was only used for medical research, but it's actually used also in areas like LGBTQ research and women's health internationally for women that are struggling with like repercussions of childcare where they don't have the medical help with issues that come about from that. So I want to do research and do data collection and analysis using that part of me that's very data driven, very detail oriented, in order to help these groups that I'm so passionate about being able to help.
That's cool. I wish our listeners could see you right now, Rebekah, because you are just beaming and glowing. And when you talk about the future and this journey and how you're taking these gifts, there's no shame in your eyes and in your vision and who you are and your ability now to use this superpower to not only see, but I think it gives you ability to see these marginalized groups, understand the pain because you felt pain, you felt shame, and just want to lift their burden. And it's really courageous and really cool. You want to go to graduate school. There might be naysayers saying, well, you've got 3 kids, you should be focused. And I just love that you're following personal revelation for you. and that this is something in your future. And I love the reason you want to do this is when you talked about why, it's all about helping other people. And I love that you and your husband are thinking out the dots sometimes. When you said, as you were discussing having more kids, it sounds like you figured out, well, this is your husband saying, I'm going to get up at night so you can sleep. And that's what I call sort of thinking outside the dots. Sometimes we have these really firm roles as men and women in a marriage. And I just love that part. And I'm assuming that part of your marriage and sort of thinking out the dots allows you to do things like, be great parents and have and have careers and have things and just recognize that you can do that. And some of the narrative we've created around shame potentially for women that want to get a graduate degree with 3 kids at home, I hope you don't feel any of that, because I would guess if you came on the podcast in 10 or 20 years and talked about what that graduate degree meant for you and what it meant for your family and others, you would be so glad that you opened the door to this. And even though it's kind of Elder Bednar's fog talk, where he just talks about you get a feeling and you kind of take one step in the fog and you see the next step or two. I love that, because that's how a lot of personal revelation comes.
Yeah.
So any thoughts that came out of what I just said that you want to, add on to or go with?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I love what you're talking about. My husband and I are definitely a team. And, when we were talking about what to do with future kids and how we were going to make sure I didn't go back into that deep, dark hole the next time we had a kid, we tried to look at what our strengths were. And my husband has a strength, thank goodness, that he doesn't need as much sleep as the average person, certainly not as much as me. And when he is woken up, he can go right back to sleep. Like as soon as his head hits the pillow, he is out. He can make up lost sleep in a 10-minute nap on the floor. Like, I kid you not, he's got a superpower with that. And so we were able to look at what our strengths were and figure out how to make it work as a team. Same thing now. I mean, he just finished his MBA, so he just did his grad school. Now we're looking at mine, and it's kind of making it work as a family. Like my youngest is 3. She'll actually be 4 next month. And so we're looking at, once she's in, I might do maybe a class here or there, but I certainly won't be doing full-time school yet until she's in kindergarten. But, that's not that far away. But it's amazing what you talked about. Julie Hanks calls it aspirational shame. And the shame some of us women in the church have about aspiring and wanting to do these great things. And I definitely had that when I was younger. I actually, my original declared major as an 18-year-old BYU student was psychology. But I knew that I was going to be a stay-at-home mom. I believed that was, what I was supposed to do as a woman. And it's something beautiful and absolutely wonderful. And I'm grateful for it. But I got the message somehow that was the only thing I was allowed to do in order to be righteous. And so I was committed to that. And so people would tell me when I'd say, hey, my bachelor's, it's going to be psychology. Everybody would tell me, well, you have to go on and get like a PhD in order to do anything with that. And I went, oh, well, I'm not going to be able to do that because I'm going to be home with the kids. So I guess I shouldn't do psychology. So I actually changed my major largely because of that and did education. And now it kind of feels full circle, because now I've learned over the years through personal study, prayer, the Spirit, through my husband's encouragement, through so many things, I've learned that there are ways to do both. I mean, I can be a good mom and I can aspire. And in fact, it's been so cool to see my kids, because they're watching me, study, what school I want to go to. Do I want to learn epidemiology or biostatistics? What areas do I want to use those in to help what marginalized groups? And my kids will ask me questions about it.
So
Mom, have
cool.
you figured out what school you're going to yet? Mom, do you want to do this? And I can see their brains going, oh, I can do this too. My daughter's going, oh, when I grow up, I can do anything I feel led by the Spirit to do and that I want to do. So it's just been really cool.
That's really cool. I love that term, Dr. Julie Hanks, who coincidentally her niece married our son this summer. So I've known her and we've interacted, but it was fun to see her at the wedding events. But I love that term, aspirational shame. And as a male, I've never obviously, there was no trade off between if I got married and but I just recognize for women, LDS women, and maybe women of other faiths, we've created that shame. Um, and I think that it's really healthy that we're hopefully getting over that, and people like you that, are helpful for that. And I love the impact that you have on your kids. Do you have sons or just three girls?
I have two girls and one boy. So
I,
it's girl, boy, girl.
I think it's good for your girls and your son. I think it's actually healthy for your son to see that in his mom, and perhaps to have just better, I think it influences the type of woman he wants to marry, and just this whole relationship with women, potentially to have you as this role model, the key role model woman in his life. So I think there's even some neat, wonderful things for your son. And I've really been grateful for my wife and the things that she's done, not only in our home, but in our community, that I think have been good for all of us. I love destigmatizing seeing a therapist. I'm writing a chapter in my book, and this book about improving LDS culture. And one of the chapters is destigmatizing talking about emotional illness. And I write here in the book, I've been to a therapist twice in my life, and once was while I was serving as a YSA bishop. I still remember the shame I felt wondering if what the YSAs would think if their own bishop was so weak that he was seeing a therapist. I remember being glad my therapist's office was in a different area of town so no one would see me.
Oh,
Since my release, I've concluded I should have felt no shame for my emotional health challenges. They were not a spiritual weakness. And my diagnosis, at least in my case, because it wasn't a major diagnosis, it was dysthymia, did not impact my ability to serve the members of the ward. If I had realized this, I might have been more receptive to spiritual promptings to open up about my own emotional health in appropriate situations to help others walking this road. And just sort of vulnerability sometimes breeds the ability to really help somebody. So, but it's taken people like you to bravely step forward. And Elder Holland's talk has been very impactful for me. Although it was given before my assignment, it didn't have enough of an impact for me to consider opening up to others the way he did in General Conference and the way you're doing right now. I think Satan's role in emotional illness is non existent. He doesn't cause emotional illness, but I think he can create shame. So I don't know how you feel about that, but I've always felt one of Satan's greatest tools is shame, and to isolate us from others, to isolate us from therapists, to conclude this as a spiritual weakness, to conclude we don't measure up as a spouse. And I don't know if all that comes from Satan or from the emotional illness itself. Any thoughts on that?
I like that. I think that's really true that, the Lord wants us to find joy. And that doesn't mean that everything in life is going to be easy. But I think when we have those feelings of shame and discouragement that keep us from connecting with others because we feel like we're not worthy to connect with them, that certainly isn't a feeling that comes from the Lord. And it's, the more that we can connect with others, I think, and the more that we can share our stories with each other, whatever those stories are, I think the more we honestly we create Zion, and we are acting as the children of God that our heavenly parents would have us be. And I think it's just beautiful when we can do that.
That's great. Anything else you'd like to share with our listeners, Rebekah?
Just one last thing, and that is that I'm an open book. Like, I would love nothing more if somebody reached out to me, email me, and started a conversation. If you have OCD, if you know somebody who does, or even if you don't, and you want to learn more, like I'm so happy to share. I'm so happy to learn from you and connect. So please reach out to me.
That's cool. How can people find you?
I'll give you my email address. First I'll say it, then I'll spell it. It's Rebekah DSC at yahoo.com. So that's REBEKAHDSC at yahoo.com.
And are you on social media?
I am. I'm on Facebook. I have a kind of long name there, but it's Rebekah Dawn Simpson Clark.
Okay. And for our listeners, we'll tag Rebekah Facebook account so you can find it, and we'll put Rebekah's email address in the podcast. I guess people call them show notes. I'm just learning these things after 300 plus episodes or the podcast descriptions. So please reach out. If you're thinking right now, Rebekah could help me and I'd love to talk to her, I think you may not be adding to Rebekah's load, or sometimes it's really helpful for people that have walked this road to continue to connect with people. It helps them. It doesn't bring them back or add to their burden. So don't down the road and say, oh, Rebekah is too busy. I think she just gave you a green light. So if you feel an impression to Dr. Rebekah, Dr. Rebekah.
Nothing would make me happier.
And I'm just, so glad you've reached out, Rebekah. On behalf of all of our listeners, thanks for being on the podcast. Thanks for sharing your journey. This is just a beautiful story. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.